My husband told me I had contributed nothing to our family for 29 years. He said it at our dining room table on a Sunday evening. Our 26-year-old daughter was sitting 6 feet away from me, and she didn't defend me. She just lowered her eyes and stared at her plate. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 52 years old. Until that Sunday night, I believed I understood the life I had built. I believed I understood my marriage. Most painfully, I believed I understood my daughter. I was wrong. Claire, I'm tired of pretending this marriage has been equal. My husband Richard said it calmly, but somehow made it worse. There was no shouting, no anger, just certainty. Richard was 55, we'd been married for 29 years. His hand rested beside a gray folder I had never seen before. I looked across the table at our daughter, Sophie. She wouldn't meet my eyes. What exactly are we pretending? I asked. Richard sighed, that this has been 50-50. I stared at him. For 29 years, Richard had called us a team. When his first business failed, we were a team. When Sophie was born prematurely and I spent nights sleeping beside her hospital crib, we were a team. When his mother became sick and needed someone to organize her appointments, medications, and bills, we were a team. And 9 years earlier, when Richard wanted to start another construction company if 2 banks refused to finance him, we had definitely been a team then. Apparently, the definition had changed. Richard opened the folder. I'd been going through our finances. For a moment, I almost smiled. Richard hadn't personally reconciled our household accounts in more than 15 years, but I said nothing. He pulled out a spreadsheet and pushed it toward me. The mortgage, property, taxes, insurance, utilities, vacations, Sophie's expenses, everything. Then he looked directly at me. When you actually look at the numbers, it's obvious who's been carrying this family. My hands suddenly felt cold. Who? I asked. Richard looked surprised that I even needed to ask. Me. One word. 29 years reduced to one word. I looked down at the spreadsheet. His business income appeared in one column, household expenses appeared in another. Beside my name was a number so incomplete that at first I thought it was a mistake. You made this? Richard glanced at Sophie. Sophie helped me. That hurt more than anything he'd said so far. I turned toward my daughter. She finally looked at me. Mom, Dad isn't trying to attack you. Then what is he doing? She hesitated. We just think you need to understand the reality. The reality? I looked back at the spreadsheet. There was no mention of the money that had paid the down payment on his house. No mention of the investment account that had covered most of Sophie's university tuition. No mention of the emergency transfers that had kept Richard's company alive when it couldn't make payroll. No mention of his mother's private care. No mention of the property taxes I'd quietly paid. There was a reason for that. Richard didn't know about all of it. Neither did Sophie. For years, money had appeared exactly when this family needed it. And because I never demanded recognition, they had apparently decided it came from Richard. I had spent 29 years protecting the people I loved from financial fear. Sitting at that table, I began to wonder whether that had been my biggest mistake. Richard leaned back. I'm 55, Claire, I can't keep doing this. Doing what? Supporting everyone. I stared at the man I'd slept beside for almost 3 decades, and I asked quietly, what do you want from me? His expression changed, only slightly, but it was enough. That's when I understood. This dinner wasn't a discussion. Richard had already made his decision. I think you should move out for a while. For the first time that evening, Sophie looked shocked. Dad. Richard raised his hand. Just temporarily until your mother figures out what she actually wants to contribute. There was that word again, contribute. I looked around the dining room at the family photographs, the chandelier my father had helped me install before he died, at the house where I'd raised our daughter. Richard thought he was asking me to leave his house. He had absolutely no idea whose money had actually bought it. I folded his spreadsheet. Once, then twice. So? Richard asked. I stood. I'll pack a bag. His shoulders relaxed. For one brief second, I saw relief on his face. He thought he'd won. He had no idea what he had just started. "20 minutes later, I came downstairs with a small suitcase. Richard was still sitting at the dining table. Sophie was standing by the kitchen counter now, staring at her phone. Neither of them spoke when they saw me. I placed my suitcase beside the front door. Then I walked into my father's old study and closed the door behind me. There was a phone number I hadn't called in almost 2 years. I found it and pressed call. A man answered on the third ring. "Claire?" "Hello, Thomas." There was a pause. "It has been a long time." "I know." Thomas Hale had been my father's attorney for more than 30 years. After my father died, Thomas became one of the trustees responsible for managing the assets he'd left behind. Richard knew Thomas existed. What Richard didn't understand was exactly what Thomas managed. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "No." Thomas became silent. I sat at my father's desk. "Do you still have authority over the Bennett family trust?" "Yes." "And the distributions connected to it?" "Yes." I looked at the closed door. "Then I need you to suspend every voluntary distribution that benefits Richard's company." Thomas didn't answer. "Claire, are you sure?" "Yes." "What about the household account?" I thought about Richard's spreadsheet, his neat little columns, his calculation of my value. "Stop that too." Thomas exhaled. "Effective when?" "Tonight." There was another silence. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "What happened?" "My husband asked me to leave the house because apparently I don't contribute enough." Thomas said nothing for several seconds. Then, very quietly, he asked, "Does Richard know who owns that house?" "No." "Does he know how much of his company financing is indirectly secured by trust assets?" "No." "Does Sophie know who paid her tuition?" I closed my eyes. "No." Thomas sighed. "Claire, I've told you for years that hiding all of this wasn't protecting them." "I know." And for the first time, I truly did. My father had created the trust 12 years earlier. He'd spent 41 years building a regional logistics company from 3 delivery trucks into a business worth more than I ever felt comfortable discussing. When he sold most of it, he didn't give me a giant check. He did something smarter. He created a trust. The income from those assets had quietly supported my family ever since. Not because Richard was poor. His construction company made money. Some years, very good money. But Richard's income was unpredictable. The trust wasn't. When Sophie needed tuition, it was there. When Richard's company nearly collapsed after a major client failed to pay him, it was there. When his mother needed private care, it was there. When our roof needed replacing, it was there. I never called those things my contributions. They were family expenses. At least, that's what I believed. Thomas interrupted my thoughts. "There's something else you should know." "What?" "Richard contacted my office 6 weeks ago." I sat straighter. "Why?" He asked questions about the house. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of questions? Ownership, equity, whether there were restrictions on refinancing. I stopped breathing for a moment. Why would he ask that? He wouldn't tell me. "Did you give him anything?" "No, he isn't a beneficiary, trustee, or authorized representative." I looked toward the door. 6 weeks. Richard had been investigating my house 6 weeks before telling me I contributed nothing. Suddenly, that gray folder downstairs felt very different. "Thomas." "Yes." send me everything Richard requested. I can have it to you tonight. Thank you. I ended the call. When I opened the study door, Sophie was waiting in the hallway. Her arms were crossed. Who are you talking to? An old friend. Mom, don't do something crazy because you're angry. I studied my daughter's face. She genuinely believed I was the emotional one in this situation. I am not angry, Sophie. And strangely, I wasn't. Not anymore. I picked up my suitcase. Richard didn't stand when I approached the door. You can stay at the lake house, he said. I stopped. The lake house. Another property purchased almost entirely with money from my father's trust. Richard apparently didn't know that either. That's a good idea, I said. Then I left. At 11:47 that night, an email from Thomas arrived. Attached were the questions Richard had sent his office 6 weeks earlier. I read the first page, and the second. By the third page, my hands were shaking. Richard hadn't simply been asking about refinancing our house. He had been trying to find out whether he could borrow against it, without my signature. I read Richard's email 3 times. The wording was careful, almost professional. He had asked whether a spouse could obtain financing against a property if the other spouse was listed as an occupant, but not an owner. Then he'd asked whether trust-owned property could be transferred into personal ownership. Finally, he'd asked what documentation would be required. I sat alone in the lake house kitchen, staring at my laptop. Richard had never asked me who legally owned our home. He had simply assumed we owned it together. That wasn't entirely unreasonable. We had lived there for 18 years. But my father had purchased the property through the Bennett family trust when Richard and I were going through one of the hardest financial periods of our marriage. Richard's first company had failed. We had debts. Our credit wasn't destroyed, but it wasn't strong enough for the house we'd fallen in love with. My father offered to help. Richard believed Dad had simply provided the down payment. The truth was more complicated. The trust purchased the house. We paid a modest monthly amount back into a family investment account. Years later, my father told me he had never intended to collect the full value. He wanted Sophie to grow up somewhere stable. I never corrected Richard's assumption. Why would I? He was my husband. It was our home. Legal ownership seemed like paperwork. Until that night, I opened another attachment. Thomas had included a summary of trust distributions over the previous 10 years. I hadn't looked at the complete list in years. Seeing the total made me uncomfortable. Sophie's education, $214,000. Richard's business emergency funding, $387,000. His mother's care, $96,000. Home repairs, taxes, insurance, and other family expenses added hundreds of thousands more. And that didn't include the original purchase of the house. I closed the document. Suddenly, Richard's spreadsheet from dinner felt almost childish. But something still bothered me. Why had he wanted to borrow against the house? Richard's company had been doing well. At least that's what he told me. I opened my banking app. For years, I had intentionally avoided monitoring his business accounts unless he asked for help. It was important to me that Richard never felt as though my inheritance gave me authority over him. Now I wondered whether I'd confused respect with deliberate blindness. At 12:26 a.m., I texted Thomas. Can you check whether Richard has requested any recent business guarantees connected to the trust? His reply came 4 minutes later. I'll look in the morning. I barely slept. At 6:42 a.m., my phone rang. Sophie. I stared at her name. For a second, I considered letting it ring. Then I answered, "Mom?" Her voice sounded different. "What happened?" "Dad's freaking out." I sat up. "Why?" "He got some kind of notification from the bank." That was faster than I'd expected. "What notification?" "I don't know, something about a transfer being canceled." I looked through the bedroom window at the lake. Morning mist floated above the water. "Then he should call his bank." "Mom?" I heard anger entering her voice. "Did you do something?" "I changed the way my money is being used. Dad says payroll is this week." "Then Dad should have payroll money." Silence. That's cold. That sentence landed harder than I wanted it to. "Sophie, do you know how much money your father's company made last year?" "No." "Do you know how much cash it currently has?" "No." "Do you know why it needs my money for payroll?" She didn't answer. Neither could I. Then Sophie said something that made me forget the entire argument. "Dad said this wouldn't be happening if you had just agreed to sell the house." I froze. "What?" Another silence. "Mom?" "Sophie, what did you just say?" "I thought you knew." My heartbeat changed. "Knew what?" She began speaking quickly. "Dad told me you two had been discussing selling the house for months. He said you kept refusing because you were emotionally attached to it." I stood. "Richard and I have never discussed selling this house." Sophie stopped talking. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Then she whispered, Oh my God." And suddenly I understood why my daughter had helped Richard build that spreadsheet. He hadn't only lied to me. He had been telling Sophie a completely different story. "Sophie, I need you to tell me exactly what your father told you." She was quiet. Everything. I could hear her breathing. Finally, she said, "He told me you were spending too much." "On what?" "He didn't really say." "Then what did he say?" "That you've been pulling money away from the family, that you refused to sell the house even though his business needed capital." I closed my eyes. It was worse than I thought. "How long has he been telling you this?" "A few months. A few months. Not one angry conversation. Not one misunderstanding. Months." "Why didn't you ask me?" "I don't know." Her voice cracked. Dad had numbers documents. He made it sound obvious. Of course he did. People trust spreadsheets because numbers look neutral. But numbers only tell the truth when the person entering them does. "Sophie, do you remember your final year at Northwestern?" "Yes." "Do you remember when you were worried about tuition?" Dad said business was slow. "And then?" "He said he handled it." I swallowed. "No, I handled it." Silence. "What?" "The money came from the Bennett Trust." She didn't respond. "All 4 years, Sophie." "Mom, that's not what Dad told me." "I know." I hated saying those words, not because I wanted credit, because I could hear my daughter's understanding of her father beginning to fracture. "What else?" she asked. I hesitated. There were truths that could never be put back once spoken. But Richard had already made silence dangerous. "Your grandmother's private care. What about it?" "I paid for most of it." Another silence. "Dad said his company covered that." "It didn't." Her breathing became uneven. Then I heard footsteps on her end. "Who are you talking to?" "Richard." Sophie didn't answer him. "Sophie, Dad, did Mom pay my tuition?" Silence. It lasted just long enough. Then Richard said, "This isn't something we need to discuss over the phone." My stomach dropped. Not denial, deflection. Sophie noticed too. "Did she?" Sophie, give me the phone. No. I'd rarely heard my daughter speak to him that way. Did Mom pay my tuition? Richard's voice hardened. We paid your tuition. That isn't what I asked. I sat on the edge of the bed. Part of me wanted to intervene. Another part knew this conversation had been delayed for years. Finally, Richard said, "Your mother's father left her money." Yes, some of that money was used. Some? I almost laughed. Sophie didn't. How much? This is ridiculous. How much, Dad? He didn't answer. Then I heard a door slam. Mom? I'm here. She was crying now, not loudly. That somehow hurt more. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were our daughter. You weren't supposed to worry about who paid which bill. But Dad told me you barely contributed. I know. I helped to make that spreadsheet. I know. God, Mom, stop. She became quiet. You made a decision based on what you were told. I'm hurt, Sophie. I'm not gonna pretend I'm not. But I don't want you blaming yourself for a lie you didn't create. She sniffed. What happens now? Before I could answer, another call appeared on my screen. Thomas, I need to take this. Okay. Sophie, don't sign anything your father gives you. She paused. Why would he give me something to sign? I don't know yet. I ended the call and answered Thomas. He didn't bother saying hello. Claire, we have a problem. My stomach tightened. What did you find? Richard applied for a $450,000 business loan 3 weeks ago. I stood completely still. Use it what as collateral? Thomas hesitated. Then he said, he listed the lake house. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I looked around the bedroom. The lake house had belonged to my father. Not technically. Technically, it belonged to the trust. But emotionally, every corner of it was him. He had bought the property when I was 17. We spent summers there. After my mother died, it became the place where Dad and I learned how to be a family of two. Richard knew what that house meant to me. He can't use it as collateral, I said. He can't, Thomas replied. Then how did the application get this far? It hasn't been approved. I felt a small wave of relief. Then Thomas continued. But Claire, there's something strange. What? The lender received documents suggesting Richard expected ownership to be transferred. I sat down. Transferred by whom? You. A chill moved through me. I never agreed to transfer anything. I know. What exactly did he give them? A draft letter of intent, signed. No, but your name is typed at the bottom. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Richard hadn't forged my signature. Not yet. But he had represented a future agreement that didn't exist. Why does he need $450,000? That I don't know? Can you find out? Not legally from the lender, but you can ask Richard. I laughed once. There was no humor in it. I don't think Richard is in the mood for honesty. Thomas was silent. Then he said, there is another option. What? The trust owns 30% of Bennett Ross Development. I knew that. 9 years earlier, when Richard couldn't secure enough capital to start his new company, my father had invested through the trust. Richard hated the idea initially. Dad solved that by structuring himself as a silent investor. No interference, no management authority, just capital. After Dad died, those shares remained inside the trust. Richard rarely mentioned them. What are you suggesting? As a significant shareholder, the trust has the right to request financial statements. I stared at the lake. Request them. Claire, once we do that, Richard will know you're investigating. He asked me to leave my own home last night. Thomas didn't respond. Request everything. I'll call you when I have it. We ended the call. At 8:13, Richard called for the first time. I let it ring. At 8:17, he called again, then 8:22. At 8:31, a message arrived. We need to talk before you make this worse. I read it twice. Before you make this worse. Not I'm sorry. Not I need to explain. I put the phone down. At 9:04, Sophie called again. Her voice was calmer. Mom, Dad left. Where? He wouldn't tell me. Are you okay? No. At least she was honest. Then she said, I found something. My stomach tightened. What? The gray folder. Richard had left it on the dining table. I know about the spreadsheet. Not that. I heard papers moving. There are emails printed behind it. Emails with who? I don't know, someone named Victor. I had never heard the name. What do they say? Sophie became quiet. Sophie. One says, once Claire agrees to the transfer, we can close immediately. My skin went cold. Read the rest. She hesitated. Then she read another line. The Riverside project can't wait another month if we don't cover the shortfall. Everything comes apart. Riverside. I knew the name. Richard had described Riverside as the biggest success his company had ever landed. A luxury development outside the city. For almost a year, he'd talked about it as proof that his company had finally reached another level. Take pictures of every page, I said. Mom, what is happening? I don't know. And that frightened me more than anything. Because for the first time in 29 years, I realized I might not know the man I'd married at all. 20 minutes later, Sophie sent me 12 photographs. The final photograph contained a number. I stared at it, then enlarged the image. Richard wasn't trying to raise $450,000 to expand his business. He was trying to replace money that was already gone. The number on the page was 612-480. Beside it, Richard had written 2 words: Riverside shortfall. I knew enough about business accounting to understand what a shortfall could mean. It didn't automatically mean fraud. Projects went over budget. Clients paid late. Contractors made mistakes. But healthy companies didn't quietly attempt to borrow against family property while telling their spouses everything was fine. I called Thomas. I sent you photographs. I see them. Tell me what you think. He was quiet while opening the files. Then I heard him inhale. Where did these come from? Richard's folder. Claire, don't confront him yet. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. Why? Because we need the company records first. Thomas, that's more than $600,000. I know. And he tried to use the lake house to cover it. I know. I walked into the kitchen. On the refrigerator was an old photograph of Dad holding Sophie when she was 6. He was laughing. She had chocolate ice cream across her face. I suddenly wished he were there. Not because I needed his money, because I needed his judgment. Dad had never trusted Richard completely. He liked him. He respected his work ethic. But once, years earlier, he'd told me something I dismissed as old-fashioned suspicion. A man who needs everyone to believe he's successful can become dangerous when he isn't. At the time, I defended Richard. Now those words returned with uncomfortable precision. At 10:46, Richard called again. This time, I answered. Claire. He sounded exhausted. Richard, what did you do? No hello, no apology, straight to the money. I stopped voluntary distributions from my trust. You can't just do that. I can. Payroll is Friday. Then use company funds. You know, construction doesn't work like that. I know exactly how construction works. He became quiet. Then his voice softened. Claire, come home. 24 hours earlier, I might have mistaken that tone for affection. Now I heard strategy. Why? Because this has gotten ridiculous. You asked me to leave. I was angry. No, you weren't. Silence. You had a folder prepared. You didn't respond. You had Sophie build a spreadsheet. Still nothing. You've been telling her for months that I was draining this family. Claire. And 6 weeks ago, you contacted Thomas about refinancing our house. The line went silent. Not quiet. Silent. I knew I'd hit something. Who told you that? Interesting question. Not that's false. Not you're mistaken. Who told you? Why were you trying to borrow against the house? I wasn't. Richard. It was exploratory. For what? My business. Which part? Another pause. Riverside? He didn't speak. I closed my eyes. How much money is missing? Nothing is missing. Then why does your folder say $612,480? I heard his breath catch. For the first time since this began, Richard sounded afraid. Where did you get that? You left the folder. Sophie went through my private documents. You involved Sophie when you used her to build a case against me. Claire, listen to me. I've been listening for 29 years. Riverside had complications. What complications? I can fix it. That wasn't my question. His voice rose. Because you wouldn't understand. I almost smiled. There it was. After telling me I contributed nothing after using money connected to my trust for years, Richard had decided I wouldn't understand his finances. Then another voice appeared faintly behind him. A woman's voice. Richard, we need to go. I stopped breathing. Richard immediately moved the phone, but I'd heard her clearly. Who is that? No one. Richard, it's a client. At 11 in the morning. Yes, I didn't believe him. But before I could ask another question, he said, I'll call you later. Then he hung up. I stood alone in the kitchen holding the phone. For the first time, the missing money wasn't the thing frightening me most. I replayed that woman's voice in my head. I knew I'd heard it before. I just couldn't remember where. For the next hour, I tried to remember where I had heard that woman's voice. It wasn't familiar enough to belong to a friend, but it wasn't new either. Then, while making coffee, I remembered. 3 months earlier, Richard had taken me to a company dinner. A woman named Natalie Ross had been sitting 2 seats away from us. She was the daughter of Richard's original business partner. After her father retired, Natalie had taken over his position in the company. She was 41, sharp, confident, and almost aggressively organized. At dinner, Richard introduced her as the person keeping Riverside on schedule. I remember joking that anyone capable of keeping Richard on schedule deserved a medal. Natalie laughed. Richard didn't. I hadn't thought about that moment again. Until now. I searched her name online. Natalie Ross. Chief Operating Officer, Bennett, Ross Development. Her photograph appeared immediately. I stared at it. Was Richard having an affair? The thought came naturally, and I hated myself for allowing it. But something didn't fit. Richard had sounded frightened when Natalie spoke. Not guilty, frightened. At 12:18, Thomas called. We received preliminary financial statements. That was fast. Because the trust owns 30% they couldn't refuse. I sat down. And? Thomas hesitated. Richard's company has a liquidity problem. How bad? Potentially catastrophic. My stomach tightened. He continued. Riverside was supposed to be financed in stages, but costs increased significantly. How significantly? About 38%. I stared at the table. Why? Materials contractor disputes delays, but that's not the worst part. Of course it wasn't. What is? Richard moved money from 2 other projects into Riverside. How much? We're still calculating. Was he allowed to? Some transfers may be legitimate, others need explanation. I pressed my fingers against my temple. And the $612,000? That appears to be the immediate amount required to keep Riverside from defaulting. So, the $450,000 loan wouldn't even cover it. No. I thought about Richard asking me to leave, then about a spreadsheet. Suddenly the cruelty had a financial purpose. If I had believed him, I said slowly, what would have happened? Thomas understood immediately. You mean if you'd agreed that you weren't contributing? Yes. Another pause. He might have asked you to prove your commitment by helping the business. With the house. Possibly. I felt sick. The dinner hadn't been about equality. It might have been preparation. Make me feel guilty. Make me defensive. Convince me I owed the family something. Then present a solution. I stood and walked toward the window. Thomas, I need every document. You'll get them. My phone vibrated. A message from Sophie. Dad came back, he's packing. I typed. Packing for where? Her response came immediately. I don't know. Then another message. Mom, there's a woman outside in a black SUV. My chest tightened. I called Sophie. Don't confront anyone. I'm looking through the upstairs window. Is it Natalie? How would I know? I sent her Natalie's photograph. 5 seconds later, Sophie answered. Yes, that's her. I gripped the phone. Stay inside. Dad's coming downstairs. Then I heard Sophie gasp. What? He has the gray folder. Stop him. What? Do not let him leave with that folder. Mom, I'm not wrestling Dad for paperwork. She was right. Take pictures if you can. I heard footsteps. Then Richard's voice in the distance. Sophie. She whispered. He sees me. The line went quiet. A few seconds later, Richard spoke directly into Sophie's phone. Claire, stop involving our daughter. My jaw tightened. You involved her first. This is business. Then why did you make it family business Sunday night? He didn't answer. Behind him, I heard a car door close. Natalie was waiting. Richard, don't destroy anything in that folder. His voice changed. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it. I will when you're ready to behave like my wife instead of my auditor. I almost laughed. Then he said something strange. And tell Thomas to stay out of this before he exposes something your father worked very hard to keep buried. My entire body went still. My father. Richard hung up. I stared at the form. Until that moment, I thought I was uncovering Richard's secret. For the first time, I wondered whether part of it had begun before my father died. I called Thomas immediately. Richard's final sentence had changed everything. What did my father keep buried? Thomas didn't answer. Thomas? I don't know what Richard meant. You're a terrible liar. Claire. My father trusted you for 30 years. If there is something I need to know, tell me now. Silence. Then Thomas said, "Not over the phone. That frightened me. Come to the lake house. I can be there in 40 minutes." He arrived in 32. Thomas was 68 now. I'd known him since I was a teenager. He entered carrying a leather briefcase and looked older than he had the last time I'd seen him. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't open the briefcase immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "Your father made me promise something." "What?" "That I wouldn't discuss certain details unless they became relevant to protecting you or Sophie." My heart began pounding. "They're relevant now?" Thomas nodded, then opened the briefcase. He removed an old file. Across the top was Richard's company name. Not Bennett Ross Development, Richard's first company, the one that had failed almost 15 years earlier. I thought that company went bankrupt because Richard lost 2 contracts. It did. Thomas pushed a document toward me. But that wasn't the entire story. I began reading. There were dates, bank records, loan documents. Then I saw my father's name. "What is this?" "Your father covered one of Richard's debts." "How much?" "Originally, $280,000. I looked up. "Originally, with penalties and other obligations, nearly $340,000. My mouth went dry. Why didn't Dad tell me? Because Richard asked him not to. I stared at Thomas. "What?" "Richard came to your father. Before the company collapsed, he said if you discovered how badly he'd managed the business, you'd lose respect for him." I felt something inside me crack. Dad paid him? Not exactly. Your father paid creditors directly, and Richard never repaid him. He repaid approximately $40,000. I pushed the document away. My father had died believing Richard still owed him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he'd never told me. Why would Dad agree to hide that? Because you were pregnant. I froze. Sophie. Thomas nodded. You'd had complications. Your father didn't want financial stress affecting you. I looked away. 26 years. The secret was older than I thought. Then another detail struck me. Wait, Richard's first company failed when Sophie was 11. Thomas shook his head. Not that company. I stared at him. What do you mean? Richard had another business before the one you knew about. The room seemed to tilt. That doesn't make sense. You were newly married. Richard invested with 2 friends. It lasted less than 18 months. I never knew. Your father did. I stood and walked away from the table. How many secrets did the 2 of them keep from me? Your father believed he was protecting you. And Richard? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. I returned to the table. What does this have to do with Riverside? Thomas pulled out another document. This. It was a shareholder agreement dated 9 years earlier, when Bennett Ross Development was formed. My father's trust hadn't simply invested money. It had included a protection clause. If Richard's company became insolvent, committed financial misconduct, or attempted unauthorized use of trust property, the trust had the right to exercise an option over additional company shares. I read the percentage twice. Thomas. Yes. If this clause is triggered, how much of Richard's company could the trust control? Thomas looked directly at me. 51%. I couldn't speak. Richard hadn't been trying to save only his business. He'd been trying to stop me from discovering that if Riverside collapsed under the wrong circumstances, I could legally take control of it. I stared at the number. 51%. Control. The word felt absurd. I had never wanted Richard's company. I'd spent years deliberately staying away from it because I wanted him to have something that was completely his. Now I discovered that my father's trust contained a mechanism capable of taking control. Did Richard know about this clause? Yes. Thomas's answer was immediate. From the beginning, he signed the agreement. That explained the panic. Richard knew exactly what could happen if the trust examined his books. Then why risk everything on Riverside? We don't know yet. I looked at the financial documents again. What triggers the clause? Insolvency alone isn't enough. There would need to be specific conditions, such as fraud, unauthorized collateral, material misrepresentation, certain transfers benefiting insiders. I stopped. Insiders? Yes. Natalie? Possibly. I told him about the woman in the SUV. Thomas frowned. Ross, you know her? I knew her father. Is she involved? I don't know. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It's my office, he answered. I watched his expression change as he listened. Send it securely. He ended the call. What? We found one of the transfers. How much? 180,000 to where? A consulting company. What company? North Star Advisory. Who owns it? They're checking. 10 minutes later, an email arrived. Thomas opened it, then looked at me. You're not going to like this. I'm getting used to that sentence. He turned the laptop toward me. North Star Advisory LLC, registered owner, Natalie Ross. I felt strangely calm. Richard transferred company money to Natalie. Bennett Ross paid North Star $180,000 over 8 months. For what? Consulting services. She already works for the company. Exactly. The obvious explanation was theft. The uglier explanation was an affair combined with theft, but I remembered Natalie's frightened voice. We need to go. Not honey, not Richard. We need to go. Could those payments be legitimate? Yes, but we'd need contracts and invoices. Request them. Thomas nodded. At 2:06 p.m., Sophie called. Mom, Dad's gone. With Natalie? Yes. Did he say where? No. Then Sophie hesitated. But I found something else. My stomach tightened. What now? There was an envelope under the printer. What's in it? A reservation confirmation. For what? A hotel? No. She sounded confused. Storage. I frowned. What kind of storage? Private document storage downtown. There was a unit number and Richard's name. Then Sophie said, Mom, there's another name listed as an authorized person. Natalie. No. Who? She read the name. I stopped breathing. It wasn't Natalie. It was Daniel Mercer, Sophie's fiancé. For several seconds, I wondered if I'd misheard her. Say that again. Daniel Mercer. My daughter began crying. Mom, why does Dad have a private storage unit with my fiancé? I had no answer. And suddenly, the betrayal was no longer confined to my marriage. Sophie wanted to call Daniel immediately. I told her not to. Why? Because we don't know what this is. He's my fiancé. I know. Then I deserve an explanation. You do. But if Daniel is involved in whatever your father is hiding, calling him now gives him time to remove evidence. The word evidence sounded terrible. This was my family. Not a courtroom, not a crime drama. My family. But 24 hours earlier, I hadn't known Richard had tried to borrow against the lake house. I hadn't known about Riverside. I hadn't known about North Star. And I certainly hadn't known my daughter's fiancé shared access to a private storage unit with my husband. Send me the confirmation, I said. She did. Thomas examined it. The facility requires identification for access. Can Sophie enter? No. Can we compel records? Not without legal grounds. My phone buzzed. Daniel. I looked at Sophie through the video call. He's calling me. Her face went pale. Answer. I did. Hello, Daniel. Claire, is Sophie with you? No. She's not answering me. She may need some space. He paused. Did something happen? I listened carefully to his voice. He sounded nervous. Richard and I had an argument. I heard. From who? Another pause. Sophie. Did she tell you why? Something about money. Something. I looked at Thomas. He was listening. Daniel, when did you last speak to Richard? This morning. Sophie covered her mouth. About what? Work. You don't work for Richard. No, but he stopped. But what? Claire, I think Richard should explain this. My heartbeat accelerated. Explain what? Silence. Then Daniel sighed. I'm helping him with a private project. What project? I can't discuss it. You're engaged to my daughter. I know. And you're keeping financial secrets with her father? It isn't what you think. Nobody in human history has ever improved a situation with that sentence. Then tell me what it is. Daniel became quiet. Finally, he said, Richard asked me to help digitize old business records. Where? Another pause. I already knew the answer. At a storage facility. Sophie began silently crying. What records? Old contracts, financial files, mostly things from before Bennett Ross. Thomas looked sharply at me. Richard's old company, the secret debt. My father. Why you? Because I work in data security. That part was true. Daniel managed cybersecurity for a healthcare company. Why didn't you tell Sophie? Richard asked me not to. And that didn't concern you. He said he was preparing a surprise. I almost laughed. What kind of surprise requires private financial records? He wouldn't say. Then Daniel lowered his voice. But Claire, there's something I think you should know. Thomas leaned closer. What? Some of the files weren't Richard's. My fingers tightened around the phone. Whose were they? I didn't know at first. And now? Daniel hesitated. Then he said, your father's. The room went silent. What did Richard want with my father's files? I don't know, Daniel. I swear. Then he added, but 3 nights ago, Richard asked me whether deleted accounting records could ever be recovered. Thomas and I looked at each other. Could they? Yes. And what did you tell him? That usually, if someone knows where to look, deletion isn't enough. My stomach dropped. Daniel, listen carefully. Do not touch those files. Do not tell Richard we've spoken. Claire, am I in trouble? I don't know. That was the truth. I ended the call. Thomas immediately stood. We need to preserve those records. How? Legally. His phone rang before he could explain. This time he put it on speaker. His assistant spoke quickly. We found the North Star invoices. Thomas asked, and? There was a pause. They're not for consulting. What are they for? Debt repayment. I stared at the phone. To Natalie? No. The assistant gave us the creditor's name. Thomas's face lost its color. I had never seen him react that way. Who is that? I whispered. He looked at me. Claire. That's the man your father paid 26 years ago. The debt Richard had supposedly settled had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting. His name was Victor Lang. The same Victor whose emails Sophie had found in Richard's gray folder. Suddenly, the pieces began connecting. 26 years earlier, Richard and two friends had launched a property investment company. The company failed. Richard owed Victor money. My father paid most of the debt to protect me during my pregnancy, or at least everyone believed he had. But according to the new records, Victor had resurfaced, and Richard had been paying him through Natalie Ross's company. "Why use North Star?" I asked. Thomas shook his head. "To hide the payments from normal company expenses, perhaps. But Natalie would have to know." "Yes. So she's helping Richard." "Maybe." I hated that word, maybe. Everything in my life had become maybe. Maybe my husband had lied for decades. Maybe his partner was helping him move money. Maybe my daughter's fiancé had unknowingly helped Richard access my father's records. Maybe Riverside wasn't simply a failed project. Thomas closed the laptop. "We need Natalie. You think she'll talk?" "I think we should give her the opportunity." I called her. No answer. Again, nothing. Then I sent one message. "Natalie, I know about North Star and Victor Lang. Call me before Richard makes another decision for you." She called in less than 60 seconds. "Where are you?" No greeting. "Somewhere safe? Is Thomas with you?" "Yes." She exhaled. "Good." I put the call on speaker. "Why is Bennett Ross paying Victor Lang through your company?" Natalie didn't answer immediately. "Because Richard asked me to." "Why?" "He said Victor was a private creditor." "Did you know about the old debt?" "Not at first." "And later?" "Yes." Thomas leaned toward the phone. "Natalie, did Richard tell you those payments were authorized by the board?" "No." "Did you invoice Bennett Ross for services you didn't provide?" Silence. "Yes." My stomach tightened. "Why would you do that?" "Because Richard told me if Victor went public, the company would collapse." "And you believed him?" At the time. Her voice began shaking. "Claire, Riverside isn't failing because construction cost went up." I looked at Thomas. "Then why?" "Victor owns part of the land." That made no sense. "What?" "Through another company we didn't know when we started." Thomas cursed under his breath. Natalie continued. 6 months into development, Victor revealed his interest. He threatened to block access rights unless Richard settled the old obligation. So Richard paid him. "Yes." "With company money?" "Yes." "How much?" Natalie went quiet. "How much, Natalie?" "Almost $900,000. I couldn't breathe. The 612-480 shortfall wasn't the total loss. It was only what Richard needed immediately. Does Sophie know any of this? No. Does Daniel? No, Richard only used him for the archive records. Why? I don't know. Then Natalie said something I wasn't expecting. "But I know why Richard wanted your father's files." Thomas looked at the phone. "Why?" "Because Victor claims your father never paid the original debt voluntarily." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" Natalie's next words came slowly. "He says your father bought something from him instead." "What?" "A document." I stared at Thomas. His face told me he knew nothing about this. "What document?" Natalie took a breath. "A document about Richard. And Victor says, if Richard doesn't pay him the rest of what he wants." She stopped. "What?" "He's gonna give it to Sophie." I felt my stomach turn. "Why Sophie?" "I don't know," Natalie said. then asked Richard. He refuses to tell me. Thomas spoke. Where is Richard now? With Victor. My entire body went cold. You drove him there? Yes. Where? Natalie gave Thomas an address. He wrote it down. Do not go back inside, he told her. I wasn't planning to. Then Natalie said, Claire, I'm sorry. For what? For helping him hide the payments. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but at least she was telling the truth now. Send Thomas every record you have. I will. We ended the call. I looked at Thomas. What document could my father possibly have bought? I don't know. You knew about the debt. Yes. But not this? No. I believed him. Thomas had looked genuinely shocked. Then my phone rang. Sophie. I answered immediately. Mom, Daniel is here. Are you okay? Yes. He told me everything. I heard Daniel in the background. There's more, Sophie said. What? Daniel made backups. I stood. Of the storage files? Yes. Daniel came onto the call. Richard asked me to scan and organize everything I created encrypted backups before working on them. That's standard procedure. Thomas nearly smiled. Where are they? On my secure server. Can you access them? Yes. Thomas and I exchanged a look. Daniel, he said, do not send anything yet. Preserve the original metadata. Okay. Can you search file names without altering them? Yes. I thought about Natalie. Victor, my father. Search Victor Lang. We waited. Keyboard sounds came through the phone. Then Daniel said, I've got 17 files. Dates, mostly 26 years ago. My heart pounded. Any document files? Yes. What are they called? He began reading. Loan agreement, settlement, correspondence. Then he stopped. What? There's a scanned envelope. What's written on it? Daniel hesitated. Claire Bennett. My own name. Open it. Thomas raised a hand. Wait. I looked at him. If your father sealed something addressed specifically to you, you should understand that whatever is inside may have been something he never intended Richard to see. I understand. Do you? No. That was the truth, but open it anyway. Daniel clicked. A few seconds passed. Then his voice changed. There's a handwritten letter. From my father? Yes. I sat down. Read the first line. Daniel swallowed, then read it. Claire, if you are reading this, then Richard has finally forced you to learn the truth I hoped you would never need. My eyes filled with tears. For a moment, nobody spoke. Dad had been dead for 7 years, and suddenly, his voice seemed closer than anyone else's in the room. Keep reading, I whispered. Daniel continued. I have spent years wondering whether protecting your marriage was an act of love. He paused. Or the greatest mistake I ever made. I covered my mouth. Then came the next sentence. And everything I thought I knew about Richard changed. Forever. Daniel's voice trembled as he continued reading. Claire, there's something I should have told you many years ago. I closed my eyes. Thomas sat across from me, completely still. Richard did not lose that first company because of bad luck. Daniel paused. He lost it because he guaranteed debt for one of his partners without telling you. My stomach tightened. Keep going. Victor Lang was not simply a creditor, he was an investor who had been promised a controlling interest if the company failed to meet certain obligations. Thomas leaned closer. That explained something even he hadn't known. Daniel continued. Richard panicked when the business began collapsing. He asked me to help because you were pregnant, exhausted, and already frightened about Sophie's health. My eyes filled with tears. Dad had remembered that. All these years later, that was still the detail that mattered to him. I agreed to cover the immediate debt, Daniel read, but Victor demanded more than money. What? Sophie whispered through the phone. Daniel continued. He possessed records showing Richard had moved funds between accounts without proper authorization. Thomas's face hardened. That could have been criminal, he said quietly. The letter went on. I purchased those records and required Victor to sign a settlement agreement. I did it because I believed Richard deserved one chance to rebuild his life honestly. One chance. My father had given him one chance. Richard had spent 26 years turning it into a secret. Then Daniel reached the sentence that changed everything. But before I died, I learned Richard had contacted Victor again. I stared at the phone. What? Daniel kept reading. Richard told me it was only to close an old administrative matter. I wanted to believe him. The next line was shorter. I did not. My chest tightened. Then came the final paragraph. If Richard ever uses your trust, your home, or Sophie's future to repair consequences he created in secret, do not protect him again. I began crying, not loudly, just enough that I had to look away. Dad had known me too well. He knew my instinct would be to fix everything quietly, to protect Richard, to protect Sophie, to keep the family intact at any cost. The letter ended with one sentence. Love is not the same thing as rescue. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, all I could hear was the small hum of the refrigerator. Then Sophie said, Mom. I wiped my face. I'm here. Did Grandpa really do all that for Dad? Yes. And Dad never told you? No. Her voice broke. Then what has our entire family been built on? That question hurt because I didn't know the answer. Then Thomas's phone rang. He answered. His assistant spoke quickly. The board records are in. Thomas stood. What did you find? There are 3 undocumented transfers tied to Riverside. How much? Combined, just over 1.3 million. My stomach dropped. 1.3 million. Then the assistant added, and one of the transfers was authorized using a document that appears to carry Claire's approval. Thomas slowly looked at me. I felt the room go cold. I never approved anything. I know. Thomas's voice hardened. Send me the document. A few seconds later, it arrived. He opened it, then turned the screen toward me. My name was there. My signature was there too. Except it wasn't mine. Richard hadn't just lied to me. He had forged my signature. For a long moment, I stared at the signature. It was good. Very good. Close enough that someone unfamiliar with my handwriting might accept it. But I knew every curve of my own name. And that wasn't mine. Thomas immediately became serious in a way I'd rarely seen. Claire, From this point forward, do not speak to Richard about these documents without me. What happens now? We preserve everything. We notify the board, we notify the lender, and depending on the exact use of this document, we may have to involve law enforcement. The words felt unreal. Law enforcement. My husband, 29 years, all suddenly in the same sentence. Sophie began crying again. Mom, is Dad going to jail? I don't know. I hated that answer. But lying to her now would make me exactly like Richard. I don't know, Sophie. Thomas looked at the forged approval. This may also trigger the trust protection clause. The 51%? Yes. I stared at him. So the trust could take control? Potentially temporarily or permanently, depending on what the board discovers. I thought about Richard's face Sunday night. His folder, his spreadsheet, his certainty that I contributed nothing. And for the first time, the cruelty made complete sense. He wasn't simply angry, he was afraid. If he could convince me that I was financially dependent on him, maybe he could pressure me into signing whatever he needed. Maybe he thought shame would make me easier to control. The thought made me feel physically sick. At 3:21 p.m., Richard called again. Thomas shook his head. Don't answer. I let it ring, then another call, then another. By 4 o'clock, there were 12 missed calls. At 4:17, a message arrived. Claire, we need to fix this before you destroy everything. I showed Thomas. He read it once, then said, he still thinks you're the problem. Yes. That hurt less now. At 4:32, Sophie called. Her voice sounded different, calmer. Mom, Dad is here. Where? At the house. Is he alone? Yes. What does he want? He wants the gray folder. I looked at Thomas. Do not give it to him. I already told him no. I almost smiled. There was my daughter. Then Sophie lowered her voice. He's crying. I closed my eyes. That image was harder than I expected. Richard rarely cried. Not when his first company failed, not when his mother died. Not even at my father's funeral. Mom, he says Victor is going to ruin him. I said nothing. He says he made mistakes, but he was trying to protect us. That phrase, protect us. The same phrase my father had once used. The difference was that Dad had used his own money and carried the consequences himself. Richard had used mine. He wants you to come home, Sophie said. I stared out at the lake. I'm not coming home tonight. Okay? Then she whispered, Mom, I'm sorry. For what? For believing him. My throat tightened. Sophie, we'll talk about that later. I should have asked you. Yes, I didn't soften it. She needed the truth, so why didn't I? I thought about it, then answered honestly. Because your father told you a story that made sense. She was quiet. And because I spent years making sure you never saw the parts that didn't. That was my responsibility. Silence had helped create this. Then I heard Richard in the background. Sophie, give me the phone. She didn't. Sophie, no. Dad. His voice rose. Give me the phone. No. Then I heard him say something that chilled me. You don't understand what your mother is about to cost you. Sophie went completely silent. What does that mean? She asked. Ray just didn't answer. Then Sophie whispered into the phone. Mom, what does he mean by cost me? I didn't know. And that frightened me. Richard, I said loudly enough for him to hear. What are you talking about? There was movement on Sophie's end. Then Richard's voice came closer. You want the truth? Fine. I'm listening. If the company collapses, Sophie's future collapses with it. My heart began pounding. Why? He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Richard. Sophie has an interest in the company. I froze. What interest? Dad? Sophie sounded terrified. Richard exhaled. Years ago, I set aside shares for you. Sophie whispered. What? I looked at Thomas. He was already checking documents. How many shares? I asked. 10%. Thomas looked up sharply. No. Richard went quiet. What do you mean, no? Thomas spoke loudly enough for the phone to hear. There is no valid transfer of 10% to Sophie in the shareholder records. Silence. Then Richard said, it was private. Thomas's expression hardened. Private equity transfers still require documentation. I felt cold. What did you do, Richard? He didn't answer. Sophie started crying. Dad, what did you do with my name? That question broke something. Richard's voice changed. Not defensive anymore. Defeated. I needed security. For what? The Riverside financing. My stomach dropped. You used Sophie's name? I used an account in trust for her. Thomas was already moving. Which account? Richard didn't answer. Which account? I shouted. Finally, he said, the education investment account. I stood so quickly the chair moved backward. That account was funded by my father. I know. And you pledged it. It was temporary. Sophie gasped. Dad, I was going to replace it. With what? Richard said nothing. I felt a rage so clean and cold that it surprised me. For almost 30 years, I had confused patience with strength. Now I understood that sometimes strength was refusing to rescue someone from the consequences of his own choices. Thomas, I said. He nodded. We have enough. Richard heard him. Claire, don't. I ignored him. Notify the board. Claire, trigger the protection review. Claire, please. I closed my eyes. It was the first time he'd said please. Not when he asked me to leave. Not when he insulted my contribution. Not when he called me cold. Now, when control was slipping away. Thomas looked at me. Are you certain? I thought of my father's letter. Love is not the same thing as rescue. Yes. Thomas began typing. Richard started talking quickly. Claire, if you do this, Victor wins. No. I looked at the forged signature on the screen. You gave Victor 26 years of power because you were too afraid to tell the truth. That isn't fair. Neither was using our daughter's future as collateral. Sophie began sobbing. Richard became silent. Then I said the sentence that ended the conversation. You told me I contributed nothing. I paused. So let's find out what happens when I stop contributing. I ended the call. At 5:06 p.m., the Bennett Family Trust formally requested emergency control review of Bennett Ross Development. By 6:40, Richard's access to certain company accounts was temporarily restricted. At 7:15, the lender suspended the Riverside loan application. And at 8:03, Natalie sent Thomas a final document. It proved something none of us expected. Richard had not been the only person Victor was blackmailing. document was old. 26 years old. A scanned agreement between Victor Lang and one of Richard's original business partners. The name at the bottom made Thomas sit back in his chair. Michael Ross, Natalie's father. I stared at it. Ross? Thomas nodded. Natalie hadn't just inherited a position in Richard's company. Her family had been part of the original disaster. The pieces shifted again. Victor had leverage over both Richard and the Ross family. That explained Natalie. Not completely, but enough. I called her. This time she answered immediately. Did you see it? Yes. My father told me 2 years before he died. Why didn't you tell Richard? He already knew. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. Then why did you help hide the payments? Because Victor threatened to release records showing my father had falsified statements during the original collapse. Her voice broke. My father is dead, but my mother is still alive. My children carry his name. I understood the fear. I didn't excuse what she'd done, but I understood it. So you and Richard were both paying Victor? Yes. Using company money? Yes. How long? Almost 2 years. Thomas looked at me. 2 years. Riverside hadn't created the problem. It had simply made the hidden problem impossible to carry. Why didn't either of you go to the police? Natalie laughed bitterly. Because Victor never asked for anything that looked like blackmail on paper. How? Consulting land access settlement fees. Every demand came disguised as business. Smart. Ugly, but smart. And Richard thought he could cover everything with my property. Yes. That answer hurt more than I expected. Natalie continued. He kept saying once Riverside closed, he'd repay everything. Did he ever mention Sophie? Silence. Natalie? Yes. My throat tightened. What did he say? That if necessary, he could leverage the education account temporarily. I shut my eyes. Temporarily. The favorite word of people who gamble with things that aren't theirs. Then Natalie said, Claire, I need to tell you something else. What? Richard didn't ask you to leave because he wanted a separation. I felt cold. Why did he? He needed 48 hours without you in the house. Thomas looked at me. For what? Documents. I immediately thought of my father's study. The storage unit, the old records. He wanted to find something? Yes. What? A release form. My heart began pounding. What release form? One your father apparently prepared years ago. For Victor? No. For Richard. Thomas stood. Natalie continued. Richard believed there was a document somewhere proving your father had forgiven the original debt and waived future claims against him. Why would that matter now? Because if he found it, he believed he could challenge the trust's protection clause. Everything became clear. The dinner, the humiliation, the demand that I leave. It wasn't emotional. It was operational. He needed me out of the house long enough to search my father's records. I felt something inside me finally go quiet. Not numb. Clear. Richard hadn't lost control in one terrible moment. He had planned that dinner. And now I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The next morning I returned home. Not alone. Thomas came with me. So did Sophie. Richard was sitting in the living room when we entered. He looked as though he hadn't slept. For a second, none of us spoke. Then his eyes moved to Thomas. You brought a lawyer into our house? Thomas answered before I could. This house is owned by the Bennett Family Trust. Richard looked at me. I saw anger, then embarrassment, then fear. Sophie stood beside me. She didn't move toward him. That hurt him. I could see it. "Where's the gray folder?" Thomas asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm not discussing business with you." "Then discuss it with the board tomorrow." Richard looked back at me. "Claire, can we please talk alone?" "No." His face changed. After 29 years? After 29 years, I think we've had enough private conversations. He looked at Sophie. "Sweetheart, go upstairs." She didn't move, no. He stared at her. "Sophie." I said no. For the first time, Richard looked truly defeated. He sat back down. I placed a printed copy of my father's letter on the coffee table. Richard stared at it. His face lost its color. "Where did you get that?" "Daniel found the backup." Richard closed his eyes. "So you know?" "I know enough." He looked at the letter, then at me. "I was gonna tell you." "When?" He didn't answer. 26 years wasn't enough. "Claire, I was ashamed." That was the first honest sentence I'd heard from him. I said nothing. He continued. "When your father bailed me out, I promised myself I'd never need help again. But you did." "Yes." "And instead of telling me, you lied." "Yes." "And then you lied again." He looked down, and again. Silence. Sophie began crying quietly. "Dad, why did you tell me Mom was the problem?" Richard's face broke. "I needed you to understand the pressure I was under." "No." Her voice shook. "You needed me on your side." He looked at her. She wiped her eyes. "And I was." That sentence hit him harder than anything I'd said. He covered his face. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was Sophie's breathing. Then Richard said, "I was terrified. I believed him. That was the tragedy. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a frightened man who had spent decades protecting his image until the protection became deceit. I thought if I could get through Riverside, I could fix everything." I asked, "And if you had to risk Sophie's money?" His face tightened. "I would have replaced it. And my house, I would have fixed that too. My signature." He looked at me. "I didn't think the document would actually be used." Thomas spoke. "It was used." Richard's face fell. Then I asked the question I'd been holding since Sunday night. "Did you ever believe I contributed nothing?" Richard looked at me for a long time. "No." Sophie closed her eyes. "Then why say it?" His answer came quietly. "Because I thought if you felt guilty enough, you'd help me." There it was. Not misunderstanding, not stress, manipulation. And strangely, hearing the truth hurt less than the lie. Richard cried. Not dramatically. He just sat on the couch with his hands clasped together while tears moved down his face. 29 years ago, that sight would have made me rush toward him. Even 5 years earlier, I might have tried to comfort him. That morning, I stayed where I was. Compassion did not require surrender. "I love you," he said. I believed that too. But love had never been the only question. "So what happens now?" he asked. Thomas looked at me. The decision was mine. I had spent the entire night thinking about it. The trust will take temporary control of Bennett Ross while the accounts are reviewed. Richard closed his eyes. "You're taking my company." "No." I kept my voice calm. "I'm stopping you from destroying it." He looked at me. "If the review finds criminal conduct, that's between you, the board, and the authorities." Sophie flinched. Richard nodded slowly. "And us?" That was harder. "I don't know." He looked broken. For once, I didn't rush to repair him. "I can't make a decision about 29 years of marriage in 72 hours. He swallowed. "Fair. But you are moving out." His eyes widened. "Claire, you asked me to leave because you needed access to my father's records." He looked down. "This time, you're leaving because I need space to decide whether I can ever trust you again." He nodded. No argument, no folder, no spreadsheet, just a nod. By noon, Richard packed 2 suitcases. Before leaving, he stopped in the hallway beneath the chandelier my father had installed. He looked up at it, then at me. "Your dad hated me at the end, didn't he?" "No." Richard looked surprised. He was disappointed. That hurt him more. He believed you could be better than the choices you made. Richard wiped his face. "Do you?" I didn't answer immediately. "I don't know yet." Then he left. Sophie stayed. We sat at the dining table where everything had begun. For almost an hour, neither of us spoke much. Then she placed Richard's spreadsheet between us. "I want to burn this." I almost smiled. "No." "Why?" "Because I want you to remember something." She looked at me. "A spreadsheet can be mathematically correct and still tell a lie." Her eyes filled with tears. "I treated you like you were lazy. You treated me based on what you believed. I should have known better." "Yes." She looked surprised by my answer. I reached across the table. "But knowing better next time matters more than punishing yourself forever." She squeezed my hand, then asked, "Are you going to divorce Dad?" "I don't know. Do you still love him?" I looked toward the empty chair where Richard had sat. "Yes." That was the cruelest part. Love hadn't disappeared. Trust had. And one of those things was much easier to rebuild than the other. The company review took 11 weeks. It uncovered more than Richard had admitted, but less than I feared. The forged approval document had been prepared by Richard and used in preliminary financing materials that mattered. So did the unauthorized transfers. But investigators also confirmed that Victor Lang had spent years exploiting old financial records to pressure both Richard and Natalie. Once Natalie cooperated fully, the entire structure became visible. Victor was eventually charged in connection with extortion and financial misconduct. That didn't erase Richard's choices. He had lied. He had hidden transfers. He had used my name. He had risked Sophie's account. No blackmailer had forced him to tell our daughter I contributed nothing. That part belonged entirely to him. The board removed Richard as chief executive during the investigation. The Bennett Family Trust exercised its protection rights. For 9 months, it held 51% voting control. I never became CEO. I didn't want to. We appointed an experienced outside executive. Natalie remained with the company after admitting her role and agreeing to oversight. Richard spent those months doing something I had never seen him do before. Nothing. No company to run. No image to maintain. No crisis to hide behind. He started therapy. At first, I assumed it was another strategy. Then he kept going even when I refused to promise reconciliation. That mattered. Sophie postponed her wedding. Not because Daniel had betrayed her. He hadn't. But because she realized how quickly she'd accepted one person's version of the truth without asking questions. Daniel waited. Quietly. No pressure. 6 months later, they chose a new date. As for Richard and me, we lived separately for almost a year. We met once a week, sometimes for coffee, sometimes with a therapist. Sometimes we argued, sometimes we barely spoke. For the first time in our marriage, we discussed money honestly. Not numbers, meaning, shame, power, fear. Richard admitted that my father's wealth had always made him feel smaller than he wanted to admit. Every time the trust rescued us, he felt grateful, then ashamed for feeling grateful. Eventually, that shame turned into resentment. Not toward my father, toward me. Even though I had never used the money against him. He'd been fighting a competition I didn't know existed. One afternoon, almost 11 months after that Sunday dinner, Richard handed me an envelope. Inside was a check, $40,000. I looked at him. What is this? The first repayment. For what? Everything I owe the trust. I almost laughed. Richard, you can't repay all of it. I know. Then why? Because your father gave me one chance. He looked down, and I spent 26 years pretending it never happened. I didn't cash the check, not immediately. I kept it in my desk for 3 weeks. Then I deposited it into the trust. Not because we needed the money, because for once Richard needed to feel the weight of giving something back. And I needed to stop protecting him from that weight. 1 year after the Sunday dinner, our family sat around the same oak table again. The table hadn't changed. We had. Sophie sat beside Daniel. Richard sat across from me. He no longer sat at the head. Nobody did. That was intentional. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, potatoes. A bottle of wine Daniel brought, nothing dramatic, no speeches, no gray folders. At one point, Sophie laughed so hard at something Daniel said that she nearly spilled her water. Richard reached for a napkin and handed it to her. For a second, I saw the old version of us. Then I realized something. I didn't want the old version back. The old version had contained too much silence, too many assumptions, too many acts of love that nobody was allowed to name. After dinner, Richard helped me carry plates into the kitchen. We stood beside each other at the sink, not touching, but not uncomfortable either. Claire? Yes. He reached into his pocket. For half a second, I thought he was going to hand me jewelry. Instead, he placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. I opened it. It was a spreadsheet. I stared at him. He almost smiled. I thought you'd appreciate the irony. I looked down. There were 2 columns. One said, money. The other said, things money couldn't measure. Under the second column, he'd written, 29 years of patience. 3 weeks beside Sophie's hospital crib. Dad's appointments. Mom's medications. Every birthday remembered. Every crisis carried quietly. Every time you believed in me when I didn't deserve it. Then one final line. The value of being loved without being controlled. My eyes filled with tears. Richard looked at the floor. I can't calculate that column. No. I folded the page. You can't. He looked at me. Do you think we have a chance? A year earlier, I would have wanted certainty. Now I understood certainty was sometimes just another form of control. I think we're building one. He nodded. That was enough. We did not magically return to the marriage we'd had. We built a different one. Separate personal accounts. Transparent household finances. No business guarantees without independent review. No major family decisions made in secret. One rule that mattered more than all the others. Silence was never again allowed to pretend it was peace. Months later, I found my father's original letter while reorganizing the study. I read the final line again. Love is not the same thing as rescue. For years, I thought loving my family meant making their lives easier, covering the gaps, fixing the problems, keeping fear away from the people I cared about. I understand it differently now. Sometimes love is helping. Sometimes love is forgiving. And sometimes love is stepping aside and allowing someone to finally feel the consequences you've spent years protecting them from. Richard once told me I had contributed nothing to our family. He was wrong, but so was I. My mistake wasn't that I contributed too little. It was that I gave so quietly that the people I loved forgot. There was a person behind the giving. I don't do that anymore. And if there is one thing I hope Sophie carries into her own marriage, it is this: never measure your worth by how useful you can make yourself to other people. A marriage is not a debt. Love is not permission. And partnership should never require one person to disappear so the other can feel important. That Sunday night, Richard asked me to leave our home because he believed I needed to learn what I contributed. 72 hours later, we both learned the answer. But the most important thing I discovered wasn't how much money I'd provided. It was how much of myself I had hidden. And getting that woman back was worth more than every account, every house, and every dollar my father had ever left me.